This is Assignment 2, Pedagogical Planning by Steven Dissegna. This quote from Churchill sums up the majority of what I have learned and understood from this unit, and also about pedagogy in general. My time in this unit has made me realize that it is not just what and how you teach that is important, but to focus on self-growth and constantly improve myself as a person as well as a teacher. This is my understanding because who you are as a person is also who you are as a teacher. And I want to be able to give my future students 100% of who I am and make sure that it is a good 100% that they can relate to, understand, and learn from. Because at the same time, I want them as students to give me 100% so that they can learn to the best they can and also allow me to learn from them and see what works and what doesn't. For our first assignment, my group chose to analyze a teacher teaching palindromic numbers. We were asked to look at and analyze another teacher's pedagogical style and see what categories it fell under, and to see how well we could read into what and how she was teaching. In the end, my group found that she used elements from both positivist and constructivist pedagogies, because she was trying to get the best from both worlds and create a style of teaching that best suited herself and her class. Even though she aimed to take the best parts of two different pedagogical styles, there were still some instances where it could have been improved for the students' learning. One of the key areas that I thought she could improve upon is the same area that I am to focus on in my own teaching and make it part of my pedagogical position. The key area was making the work relevant. This to me is key so that students understand why they are doing the work and also to why it is important outside of school. One of the ways I have come to learn about improving my pedagogical stance as well as myself is to reflect upon my teaching in all its elements. Those elements being how, what, why, and who I teach. Being able to look back over my own teaching has and will allow me to change and improve myself as a person and a teacher, because in the end, you cannot change one without changing the other. One of the key questions I've come to ask myself is, what makes the difference between a good teacher who makes it easy for students to learn and a poor teacher who does not? This question comes from Ray Killen, and it has made me aware that in order for students to learn, the teacher needs to have the appropriate pedagogical position that first and foremost helps the student. From observing how others teach, I have had the chance to improve my own pedagogical stance, but reading, observing, and reflecting about others' teaching styles will only get me so far. Just like some of the students I have come across, we learn by being involved, and even better, getting our hands on what we are learning. The image reflects just that. One of the students out of the two who were selected by my mentor teacher and myself is a perfect example of needing that involved hands-on approach to give the best chance of learning to occur. The other student was able to learn just as well through listening and completing work, whether it had been on worksheets or an activity. From seeing how completely different two students are in terms of how they learn when they came from the same class has taught me that trying one style of teaching will only ever work for some of the students, but I've also learnt that it is nearly impossible to cater for all the learning styles. So as a teacher, I aim to cover as many bases as possible without spreading myself too thinly across all areas, meaning some days I would focus and try to do more hands-on activities, some days I would do more class-based discussions and modelling, and some days where worksheets and individual work is done, trying to make sure all students' learning needs are covered in something I have come to learn as the base of my pedagogical stance, and it is all thanks to those two very unique learners. From my observations of the two learners, I have found them to be nearly polar opposites of each other, which made for good comparisons. One of the other key points that I have come to realize and understand about different students and how they interact in the classroom is to make sure that how the classroom is set up and managed gives all students a chance to not just learn, but also to not be distracted. And it may not be a main point in a pedagogical position, but I have learnt and will in the future incorporate good classroom management into my personal pedagogy. One of the ways I have seen and have learnt to deal with students becoming distracted or distracting others is to preemptively move them to somewhere they are more likely to concentrate and allow everyone to learn. By preemptively moving students, it has a chance to increase all students' learning and understanding. To me, I view education simply as a way to give students the best chance to grow and become something greater than they could have been without it. It is our job as teachers not to try and cram the curriculum into every student's heads, but to allow students to form their own ideas about what we are teaching them and getting them to think for themselves and form their own ideas about the world. Hinchey states that knowledge is not something existing independently in the world, just waiting for us to find it. Instead, knowledge comes into being only when a human being examines data and assigns meaning to it. This view on how knowledge comes into being is linked to my idea of giving students the best chance to grow. And to me, the best chance to grow is by having the chance to look at something and interpret it for yourself and create your own views and ideas about it, without someone else telling you how it should be and how it should be seen. I also know that applying this idea has its flaws, especially when it comes to teachers giving facts and statistics which cannot really be interpreted, but more so learnt. But it is not to say that how students get to that idea can't be their own journey, and that teachers can be their guides, not instructors. This idea of helping students grow their own interpretation and helping them reach the information to form their own ideas is a constructivist pedagogical stance which I take. It is because of my time in the classroom that I have formed this stance and wish to keep the idea of kindling a flame or growing students' ideas at all times in my classroom. From my time in this unit, I have become well aware of the differences between constructivist and positivist pedagogies. Constructivist being about students creating their own interpretation of information, as well as how teacher would use individual or small group work to teach a lesson, whereas a positivist class would look more like students being filled with information from the teacher, where the teacher stands at the front of the class and simply tells and expects the students to learn the information. Also from this unit, I have become aware of the fact that positivist classroom is a seemingly negative one. That is not to say that it doesn't work or that it is bad, it just means that out of the two, positivism comes off second best. But for me, positivism has its place in the classroom. The teacher just needs to know when to use it and when to put it away. This all comes down to the point of view on how well it can work in the classroom. If it is used poorly, or for all the lessons, it can come across as it does in the picture, boring, forced, and stressful. But this is not the way to use it. For me, I have found within the lessons I have taught, using a positivist approach as the start of the lesson gives the students a focus and the basic concepts for the lesson. And once that is done, I moved on to a constructivist approach and used group work and individual work to allow the students to make sense of their own opinions of the work. So for me, how I teach comes down to my point of view on the lesson at hand and seeing what works best, whether it be positivist or constructivist. Within this unit, this resource was one that stuck to me because it was one of the areas that I believe I need to improve upon. The reason why I chose the quote, "The important focus in behavior modification involves the relationship between behavior and the consequences that follow behavior. The important emphasis is whether or not behavior is followed by a pleasant or an adverse experience," is because I feel personally like it is one of the areas in which I could most improve upon in my pedagogical position. Because pedagogy is based on who I am as a person and how I teach, I need to be able to create a classroom that everyone can participate in and allow me to help them find information and make sense of it. If a class is being distracted or interrupted, I need to know either how to prevent it or how to have the right consequences so that it will not happen again. This all comes down to experience and knowing how to deal with students who are being troublesome or distracting. An example consequence that I was able to use effectively when I was taking my first math lesson on placement, a couple of girls decided to sit together, which at first I didn't think anything of it, but it was very quickly apparent that they simply wanted to talk, and so as a consequence of them talking, I moved each of the three girls apart and continued the lesson. My mentor teacher saw this and told me that it was a smart move. From that lesson on, I was able to see who should be sitting together and who should not. It may have been simple and obvious as to what to do, but it was a situation that I was able to learn from and add to my pedagogical position. It was from this text that I was able to realize that appropriate consequences are needed for different behaviors in order to prevent and change the way the classroom works for the better. The reason that I am including one of my lesson plans from placement is to show what I learnt was needed for a level 1 math lesson. And at first, it appears very minimalist, and that is one of the key ideas that I learnt while on placement. That over-planning and including too much just means that the plan will be harder to understand and there will be far too much to go through in a small amount of time. In a strong way, completing lesson plans showed me how much had to fit into one lesson, while also having to answer extra questions, organizing students, and also allowing students to finish their work. This has made me rethink how much information is actually required for a lesson plan, and also thinking about realistically what the students can accomplish in a certain amount of time. These thoughts only arose this year because of the amount of lessons that I taught and how much I needed to fit in. So in a way, both making a lesson plan and teaching the lesson has caused me to modify my pedagogy to incorporate the idea of having a realistic task in mind. I could not tell you how many times I have seen Rita Pearson's talk about how every kid needs a champion, but I can tell you that every time I do see it, it has the same effect. It makes me think and realize how much students look up to teachers and how much teachers can have an effect on a student's life. And to be honest, sometimes that scares me. Being someone who students look up to and is expected to know all the answers can be a bit intimidating, but because of that fear of letting down a student, it makes me try that much harder. The two quotes that I have included on the slide are the ones that have stuck with me after the very first time I saw this video, and the ones that have the most meaning to me and the way that I teach. The first quote resonates with me because I know personally when I was in primary and secondary school, a teacher who came across as someone who I didn't like, I paid less attention to, which in turn meant that I missed out on information, and so part of my pedagogy is to try and be as nice as possible while still maintaining that student and teacher relationship. The second quote is there because teachers don't know everything and sometimes even make mistakes, and with those mistakes the teacher needs to apologize for them. This has happened to me on placement when I gave out the wrong activity because I read the title of the activity wrong, and so I apologized to the students and explained what happened. And we moved on. By simply apologizing, it allowed the students to understand what had happened and why we had to move on. In some big ways, Rita Pearson has influenced my pedagogy and allowed me to become a better teacher for it. Having the opportunity to work in small groups meant that I was able to see a variety of different perspectives all focused on the same issue. Having the variety of views, I was able to question my own stance on the topic of discussion. The purpose of the micro-teaching was to learn from each other the ways in which we had handled different situations and what we had applied in the classroom that worked and what didn't. In this way, it was a form of reflection that involved outside sources to gain different points of view as well as feedback from peers. Killen states that if teachers want quality learning to occur in their classroom, they must deliberately teach in ways that will enable and encourage students to engage in intellectual activities that promote quality learning. And what better ways to make sure that quality learning is taking place than to reflect upon my own teaching? A way to reflect is to use productive pedagogies framework. Productive pedagogies is a way of looking at how well the students are engaged. Does my teaching and assessment support or hinder students' engagement? And also, what opportunities do I have to critically reflect upon my work with colleagues? The micro lesson is a perfect example of critically reflection upon my work with colleagues/peers. By constant reflection, I will continually grow as a teacher, but I will also be able to constantly improve my pedagogical position. Thank you for listening to my pedagogical position and what I have learned from this unit.